All right. I think I'm live. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us at our 13th Salem Literary Festival. I'm Lauren Sapero, a member of the team of the Salem Athenaeum staff and volunteers who bring you this festival each year. I'm very pleased to introduce this session. Everyone is reading LGBTQ+ novels. But before I introduce our authors, I want to give you a quick overview of how this will work. We're all Zoom experts at this point, but it's always good to refresh. We have pasted our anti-harassment policy at the top of the chat, so everyone knows the rules up front and center. We don't anticipate any problems, but we also want to make sure that everyone knows how important it is to us that this is a safe community space. As I mentioned, most of you are Zoom experts, so I do have just a few quick tips for you. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to answer them after the conversation. Any extraneous comments can be put in the chat, but I am going to say one more time to please put any questions in the Q&A box versus putting them in the chat. If they're in the chat, we won't see them, and we want to see all of your wonderful questions. If you'd like to use closed captioning, just click on the box that says CC at the bottom of your screen. And that's it. We're ready to go. So let me introduce our guests. And I'm going to begin with Kaysen Callender. So I'll let them appear here with me before I read. Hello. Kaysen Callender is the best-selling and award-winning author of multiple novels for children, teens, and adults, including the Stonewall Honor book, Felix Ever After, and won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature for King and the Dragonflies. Kaysen enjoys playing RPG video games and currently resides in Los Angeles. Lev A.C. Rosen writes books for people of all ages. Most recently, Camp, which was the best book of the year from Forbes, Elle, and the Today Show, amongst others, and is a Lambda finalist, an ALA Rainbow List Top 10, and is being adapted into a film directed by and starring Billy Porter. His next book, Lavender House, will be released October 18th. He lives in New York City with his husband and a very small cat, who you might see today in the background. You can find him online at levacrosen.com and at levacrosen on social media. So I am going to jump in, very excited to have you both here, and ask you to do a quick pitch for your books. So starting with Kaysen, will you please do a quick pitch for Lark and Kasim Start a Revolution, and a reminder to everyone in the audience that this will be out on September 27th. Oh, it looks like you're muted. Technical difficulties. We're going to have John in the back help Kaysen with the mute button. In the meantime, I'll switch over to Lev quickly to provide us with a quick pitch for Lavender House, which will be out on October 18th. Oh no, you're muted too. Everyone's muted but me. Okay.
Nightmare. Okay, I think it's working now. Sorry about that. So my pitch for Lark and Kasim Start a Revolution is that 17-year-old non-binary Lark wants to be a published author, but they think that the only way to do that is to gain 50,000 followers on Twitter, which is incorrect, but they think that's the only way, and they're well on their way. But then their former best friend and now #1 enemy Kasim accidentally posts on Lark's Twitter account about Kasim's unrequited love story, and that goes viral. And Lark is pulled into a lie as they kind of take ownership of that unrequited love story. And I also love to always say that one of my favorite tropes is when the main character is super oblivious to when someone is in love with them. So Kasim has so obviously written it about Lark, and everyone knows that Kasim's in love with Lark, but Lark is just, whoop, does not get it.
That was one of my favorite parts. I love that too. The whole time I was just like, Lark, oh my gosh, come on. And okay, Lev, if you'll please do a quick pitch for Lavender House, which again is out on October 18th. And John, it looks like we might have another mute problem.
Hi, yeah, it looks like I muted when Kaysen started speaking and then I couldn't unmute. So it looks like we're having a situation where if we mute, someone else needs to unmute us. But hi, I'm Lev Rosen, sometimes LC Rosen, and Lavender House. Lavender House is a 1950s queer murder mystery, and it stars Evander Andy Mills, who was a cop on the San Francisco Police Department until he is caught in a raid on a gay bar and fired and kicked out of his apartment and contemplating suicide when a woman sits down next to him at a bar, tells him she knows exactly why he was fired, and she wants him to solve the murder of her wife. And she brings him back to Lavender House, which is the seat of the La Montagne soap empire and centered on a lavender marriage, which was when a queer woman and a queer man would marry each other for appearances' sake. And when you're selling soap, appearances are very important. So in this house, which has the widow and the son's boyfriend and the son's wife and the wife's girlfriend, all of a sudden he has to figure out if this woman was murdered, and if so, who in the family would have done it. And he's at the same time is sort of lured into the apparent freedoms within the house that make it sort of a gilded cage.
Amazing. Yes, I definitely loved the way that you connected all those characters together. And we're definitely going to speak a little more to that as we get into it, because I said to both of you backstage that you both did characterization just differently, obviously different books, but like so strong. And it was definitely exciting to be able to just like deep dive into characters and see how they're feeling and, I don't know, explore their worlds with them, which is the whole thing.
Thank you.
So you both actually mentioned knowing each other very well backstage, which I didn't know. And so before I get into my questions, I would love for you both to just talk about how you know each other and your relationship, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, sure. Kaysen was one of the editors on my first YA novel, Jack of Hearts and Other Parts. So we've known each other for years. And in fact, the launch for that, which was my first YA, and I think Kaysen's first YA, we had that together as well.
Yeah, that was in 2018.
Yeah, we've come up together in the YA world.
Yeah, lifetimes ago though.
Yeah, a whole COVID ago.
Right.
A whole COVID, a partial COVID ago.
Yeah.
And that's actually another element that was sort of like an early thread for this panel, was that you both write YA and crossover into adult. And so maybe we could actually, again, before we get to my pre-planned questions, sort of talk a little bit about what made you both maybe start with YA initially and then branch into adult. Like why move around? Why do both?
Well, I started with middle grade, and I think that this answers your question even more, because I heard and I kind of like kept it with me, like another author suggested to me that the reasons that we write in certain categories are those are the ages that our inner child are still kind of like at a place that needs, or where our first trauma came in, or where we need the healing. So I feel like I started with middle grade, where I had a lot of issues that we obviously don't need to get into. And then I kind of like moved into YA. And I think that these days I'm moving into adult, the more that I heal my inner child. That's definitely a personal thing for me. I don't think that that is necessarily the case for all middle grade authors, but yeah.
And my first book was actually an adult, but it was sort of it was the new adult category. It was a college age protagonist. And for me, I think it's really just about writing the books I want to read. And so, and that doesn't necessarily mean contemporary me, although adult books are usually the books I'm writing for me. But like when I write YA, I'm thinking about what would I have wanted to read or needed to read, which I think gets back to Kaysen's point, as a teenager. And I've also written middle grade, and that was also the same vibe. So I like to write. I think our first audience is always ourselves, and whether that's dealing with trauma or attempting to fill in something that you wish you'd had, that's what I'm always thinking about when I'm writing for various age groups.
I love that as a message for any authors or writers who are out there who are watching this. I think that sometimes it can be hard maybe to connect with story or figure out why story isn't working, but hearing you both say that you are writing for who you were or your own personal growth or what you would have been looking for as a kid, I feel like that can be something that people can connect with and maybe bring to their own work, which is so valuable. And like everyone wants to see a spark in story, I think. And so that to me sounds like where you find your spark to be able to jump into something and really go deep with characters and also like find setting, and it kind of just spirals from there, it seems.
I think it has to be personal in some way. If you're, writing for someone besides yourself, that becomes, it's possible, but it's very difficult. And I think you have to always sort of figure out where you lie in the equation in terms of who you're writing for.
Okay. All right. Well, I love that. That's amazing. I want to jump into these two books. And we're going to start right at the top with the dedications because I loved both of them. And if you both are comfortable sort of speaking to them, I think that would be so great. So Kaysen, I'm going to start with you. And you dedicated Lark and Kasim for everyone who is learning to love themselves. Could you talk to us a little bit about self-love and why you wanted that message of support out into the world, especially geared toward teens for this book?
Yeah, for sure. Lark and Kasim has a lot of themes that kind of intertwine. And I think the overall theme that always comes back to is loving yourself. The book is a lot about accountability, as Lark learns that they have been lying because they are a people pleaser for the sake of their own safety, which ties into a lot of conversation about who gets to be safe, who gets to make mistakes. As marginalized people, I feel like we're given less space to make mistakes. And I enjoyed playing with like the fourth wall a bit, as Lark is literally a character who wants to be likable. I feel like marginalized people, I've seen like my characters be considered unlikable for making mistakes. So I kind of like continue to tie it back to the idea of safety for the sake of, sorry. I should also say it is 7 o'clock in the morning for me, so I'm still kind of like waking up. But so I feel like it always tied back to the theme of loving yourself for self-love, and accountability is a part of self-love, I think. Learning that you are worthy of love even as you make mistakes, and you're worthy of respect even as you're making mistakes. So that was like one part of learning to love yourself, but the book goes into a lot of different elements of how to love yourself and what that looks like, and how to learn to love yourself in a world that doesn't really love you back.
Yeah, the book definitely touched on all of those things. And I did feel like it was a good roadmap, but not in a nonfiction book kind of way of like, as I was reading it, I was able to see all of the different ways that learning to love yourself unfolded within the pages. And I feel like if I had read it as a teen, I definitely it would have helped me. That's all. Just like it would have been a valuable resource, but also within fiction pages. So it feels more comfortable as opposed to just reading like a textbook.
Yeah.
Lev, you dedicated Lavender House to your Aunt Goldie, who could absolutely get away with murder. Maybe she already has. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact this amazing sounding lady had on you and maybe the story? Obviously nothing incriminating. We support Aunt Goldie over here.
I mean, yeah, Aunt Goldie is a big fan of the old noir movies, and so is my father, her brother, and I was sort of raised on a lot of old noir because of that, and that very much was the inspiration for this book. That sort of, I eventually did come around to the books. I've read all of Chandler. I love the books, but I definitely started in the film place, and I think the films do have a slightly different tone sometimes, and part of that is because of the Hays Code, which made the endings of certain books not allowed to be featured on screen because they had to follow certain moral standards, and certainly some things were cut from the books, like queerness, which is in one of my favorites, the Big Sleep. There is a whole queer plot line and queer characters, and just not in the movie. There were implications, there were ways they sort of got it across, but what I love about the films, partially because of the Hays Code, is that there is still, even though there's this sense of hopelessness, and in noir there's always this feeling that you are trapped and the world is closing in around you, and you need to somehow survive that. In some of my favorite noirs, like The Big Sleep, it ends with them sort of deciding to cover up this murder and send someone to an asylum to sort of, instead of having them face trial, and they're gonna lie, and there's this sirens in the distance, and Bogart and Bacall are clutching each other, and Bacall turns to Bogart and says, "You forgot about one thing," and he goes, "What did I forget about?" And she goes, "What about me?" And he goes, "Oh, what?" So there's still this sense that they're in it together. There's romance. There's like this underpinning of hope, this sort of like softer noir that I was really trying to express in Lavender House as well. And I think that really informed the way I wrote the book.
It's interesting to hear you say that it was almost like film that sort of inspired your story, or maybe your interest in like picking up noir. And I feel like it was the same for me. And I wonder if it's going to be the reverse now, where people are seeing your book and seeing other more like mystery noir-esque titles, and it encourages them to go back to watch those older movies.
I mean, I'd love that. I could give, email me if you want Rex.
So I'm going to touch on tone, and I want to talk a little bit about the distinct style and voice that you both have for these books that you had to create to set the atmosphere for us and sort of let us know where we are and what we're doing, that kind of thing. And so I'm just going to read one quick sentence from each so that the audience can kind of understand where we're coming from again. So from Lark and Kasim, my phone buzzes. I spin around in my chair so fast I almost fall. Birdie laughs. Frank Ocean plays. I chew some strawberry pocky. Another notification. Phone vibrating against my desk. And then from Lavender House, and I do want to say that I desperately want to read this in like a mobster voice, like from The Thin Man, and do the whole thing, but I'm not a voice actor, so everyone's just going to have to like get the audiobook and use their imaginations here. But from Lavender House, murder, she says suddenly, in the same hard tone she used to order her drink, which she now lifts and finishes in one swallow. You've solved those before, right? Sure, I say, plenty. This is someone close to you. This is someone you've been crying over? Or this is the one you've been crying over. I'm sorry, I misread that. And so starting with Kason, can you tell us how you decided on the voice for Lark and how you sort of came to the overall style of this story?
Yeah, Lark is neurodivergent, maybe has ADHD or autism or both, and that is where I'm at. And I wanted to, with my own identity, so I wanted to sink into a neurodivergent voice, understanding that there's so many different ways to actually be neurodivergent, but I wanted to sink into mine, and I wanted to showcase that because I felt like as I was writing my past books, I tended to mask, is what people would kind of call it, is kind of like try to change our tone, our style, or our voice to neurotypical standards. So I wanted to lean into the idea of just being as kind of like whatever thought comes to me, I'm just going to put on the page, and not really stopping myself or like stopping themselves for the sake of other people's comfort. You know, if this is going to be a book about self-acceptance and self-love, then why not? And I felt like that line was the perfect kind of example of like, it's just all over the place. It's just chaos, and I love it. So yeah.
That's amazing. I think that's another great talking point here a little bit, that you don't have to continue on if you don't want to, but there being that there are different ways that neurotypical people go through their lives. They're like, everyone is different. But there might be similarities. And so it's great that you were able to channel a little bit of yourself into Lark, and that maybe even if it isn't someone's exact experience, it is something that people can hold on to and stay connected to, and know that like there is a little piece of themselves or the community out there for them to take in and have, which is really valuable. Lev, can you speak a little bit to Lavender House?
I mean, obviously, like one of the things I immediately sort of grabbed onto was the sort of noir voice, the private detective. You know, I love Chandler once I got to the books. And so that voice was very important to me, and I wanted to make it feel noir. But in terms of Andy's character and the way he views the world, there was some back and forth with my agent early on about like, you know, what makes a PI and, you know, what's special about him. And it doesn't have to be as, you know, out there as some stuff, you know, you think of TV sort of network mysteries, and they all have, I go back to that 30 Rock sketch where Jenna says, you know, she played her character's last name was good looking, and her special ability is she was good at looking. And like that's sort of like, you know, how you hear mysteries pitched on TV sometimes, I think. And I really did not want to go that extreme level, but I did sort of think about what made him special, and what made him special is this ability that he to stay in the closet even when he'd been a cop. And so I sort of translated that into this sort of character who takes pride in the fact that, you know, he sort of gets away with something until he doesn't. But because of that pride he has in being able to keep his own secret, he's very good at sort of seeing other people's secrets. And he thinks of them as like inferior. He's kind of very cocky and then brought down immediately. And I like playing with that sort of broken narcissism, and also reckoning with the fact that, like, you know, he was one of the people who's now oppressing him, and that means he was one of the people oppressing these people who are now his community, and he has to really deal with that over the course of the book.
I'm glad you said that, because you're sort of leading into my next question. So I'm going to stick with you for a minute and ask you to tell us a bit more about how you did craft Andy, the main character, and sort of that feeling of the tug of wanting to help, because he does express that, like, or at least he thinks that he's helping sometimes, but then often finding himself standing aside in other times, and how you found the balance with this character, where I personally never found him unlikable, which isn't a bad thing to have an unlikable character, but following him through the story, I did root for him, despite him occasionally doing things that were a little like, oh, why did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, early on, one of the first things that happened, you know, it starts with him in this bar having been fired. And when Pearl sits down next to him, you know, and she's trying to hire him, one of the first things she asks is like, you know, how did you get caught? And he's like, I had a system because I knew who was going to be, you know, doing the raids. But one guy, you know, messed something up one night and I got caught in the wrong place. And she's like, oh, if you had a system, did you ever warn anyone? And he's like, he just doesn't answer the question, because they both know the answer is no. He was looking out for himself. And as he, you know, when he gets to Lavender House, where all the staff are also queer, you know, the staff are just, one of them is just fully, I have no interest in talking to you. I have no interest in forgiving you. you are part of the problem. And I think that's a moment where he's like, I definitely was. And over the course of this book, he has to sort of deal with that while also sort of understanding how being on the police force also beat him down, and not literally, although that does happen during the book. But he thinks about the war, and it's interesting in doing a lot of historical research. World War II was in many regards, it was very freeing to be in the Navy. He was in the Navy, and this is talked about a little in the book, and as I've been writing the sequel, I've gotten more into it. The armed forces, until 45, well, until 48 really, were sort of very free about sexuality. Obviously, it wasn't like, hi, I'm an openly gay admiral, I can say words, or anything like that. But it varied ship to ship. So there are stories of like men just making out on their ship when they're out at sea, and the captain being like, guys, can you just not do that, where we have to look at the horizon? And then there are other stories of the captain immediately court-martialing them. So it varied wildly. But for a lot of queer men, because they were all sort of brought together, it was a very freeing period for a lot of them. And then immediately after, it was the last few years of the war, they started figuring out there were queer soldiers. What do we do about this? Excuse me, I have someone who wants to say hi. Hello. And during the war, there was this sort of, at the end of it, they sort of started cracking down, and that sort of leads into the Lavender Scare of the early 50s, when the government is, when every newspaper headline was like, perverts in the government, something like that. And that mentality, I wanted to sort of figure out what it was like to go from one to the other. And with Andy, my reaction was, he was someone who genuinely wants to sort of help people, but now he's gone from feeling very free to very, very scared. And so he seeks solace in the police force, where he feels like he's protected, but also where he knows he has to be on guard all the time. And that's what helps protect him. And I think that mentality is what really sort of informed him, and realizing how damaged he has been by it over the course of this book, and how freed he almost is by having been outed.
I loved the insertion of those historical elements. It makes sense, obviously, being a part of a noir book, but I genuinely didn't know as much about the Navy. I just generally don't know that much about the Navy, I think, but also that element. There you go, book research, it sucks us all in. And so it's exciting to know that there's going to be more of that in the second book, and that we are sort of learning a little bit more about queer history through this book that's fictional, but does carry through those like historic elements. It's very cool. Hopping over to Lark and Kaysen. So Lark feels the tug between right and wrong, and we see that throughout the story, but sort of from the perspective of everyone wanting sort of like the same end result. So for example, Lark and Kasim have an early argument about whether looting helps or hurts their community, but ultimately they both want to have a safe and strengthened community out of that. And so can you speak to why having this back and forth between our two characters, where both sides raise these clear, solid points, but there isn't necessarily like a correct answer? You don't answer this for us, and neither of them do either. And can you tell us like why this was so important for the story and for the characters?
Yeah, I think that I personally just tend to see the pros and cons of each side. I think that when I think about community, for me, it's helpful for everyone to be able to see the pros and cons of each side, instead of saying like another person is the bad. I think we can all agree that what is harmful is like capitalism, like police brutality. Like we can all agree on that. So what's the next step to coming together as community, and for me, it is kind of like seeing that we all do want the best for everyone, but it's like kind of like working through those issues and conflicts together in a way that we understand that everyone's worthy of respect. And yeah, I think that that reflects Lark and Kasim's characters, because Lark is also in that position of everyone needing to realize that they are worthy of respect even as they make mistakes. So that was like one example, but throughout, Lark is also kind of like called out a lot for the mistakes that they make. And they need to realize that it's not about like saying, oh, you have made a mistake and so you need to be ashamed of that mistake for the rest of your life. And you need to realize that you know, you're just not like a part of the community anymore. You're like excommunicated. It's more like you've made a mistake, and now because you're worthy of still existing, you can make you can take accountability for that mistake, apologize, and do what you can to make up for it and feel guilt rather than shame. So yeah, this is my ADHD brain. That's not even your original question, but I've like swerved into something else. But yeah, I think I did answer your original question.
You did. No, I think that's great, especially because there are people, myself included, where it's, and I'm an adult, where if I make a mistake, it's like I can really fixate on that, and it can take me out. And I think for teens, it's really good to know that like you can make a mistake. It's okay. Like we've sort of entered this era where like people are so afraid, and like making mistakes is a part of life. And so I think that's really valuable to include. And I also loved the relationship that Lark and Kasim have, where they argue, like they fight quite a bit. And it was never off-putting or anything like that. It was like, wow, like they're having these really great discussions. And even though we do hear Lark, you know, in their mind, being maybe occasionally like frustrated or saying, oh my gosh, why does he have to be this way? It's nice to know, or nice to see on the page, that you can have a butting heads relationship with someone, but you can still care about them. Like Lark does deeply care about Kasim, even when they are in their toughs, in their breakaway periods, in their together periods, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I did want to, sorry, I like jumped in. I did feel like I wanted to show like really in-depth conversations about what it actually looks like to have like a struggle with someone and to work through it, rather than kind of like the fight. And then kind of, I feel like sometimes stories kind of like skip over the what does healing relationships actually look like. So I wanted to show that. Yeah.
Yeah, like a lot of stories can feel like maybe like Thanksgiving dinner occasionally, where it's like you fight with somebody and then you don't see them for a year, and you come back and you're like, oh, I'm gonna fight with this person again, and then just never see them again for a while. So it was good to see that healing and growth throughout the story. My next question. So we talked about characters a little bit here, but I mentioned before that both of your books are extremely character-led. And a theme throughout both of your books, I think, was that many of the characters both wanted to be seen, very much wanted to be seen, but they also feared truly being seen by the people around them. And so I would love it if you could speak to why you included that thread in your stories, and that being seen, fear of being seen kind of situation. Jason, if you wanted to lead us up on this one, since I doubled up on that last time.
Sure. Yeah, the fear of being seen. I think that for Lark and for a lot of marginalized people, this kind of returns to the theme of making mistakes and whether you're allowed to make mistakes as a marginalized person. And if you will allow me to just go like on an ADHD tangent for a little bit, the craft of like building characters, I realized, is that towards the beginning, the character really needs to be a person that is making these mistakes. And then in order to have a character arc, they are learning from those mistakes as the story progresses. And then towards the end, they've like changed and they've grown into another person, hopefully for the better. And I feel like I've seen in most marginalized authors' books and for marginalized characters is that once they make mistakes in the beginning, that's when they are deemed an unlikable character, even though this is a part of craft. And when you see that for like white characters, that's just kind of like, oh, that's fine, that's normal. And I shouldn't even just say like just white, but for like more privileged characters, I guess I should say. So what lost my train of thought. Not sure why I went on that tangent. This was originally about characterization, right?
And just, yeah, and just characters sort of like wanting desperately to be seen by the people around them,
Yeah,
or even
that's
like
what it was.
validated by the people around them, but also
Yeah.
feeling that fear of ultimately being seen by the people around them.
Yeah, so I was saying all that because characters are supposed to make mistakes, and I'm realizing that marginalized character, like as a marginalized character, Lark does not want to be seen because they don't want to be seen as a person who's making mistakes, because then they're not going to be safe. And this is a world that they even towards the beginning, they're just outright like, this is not a safe space. Like the world is just not a safe space for me. Even just entering this world is a trauma as like a Black, queer, trans person. And that's something that I've experienced. So I think that by like minimizing themselves as much as possible, by like being a perfectionist, by being a people pleaser, by not being that character that is allowed to make mistakes. And I do have a good time like breaking the fourth wall with that quite a bit. They just don't want to be seen. And I think that that's something that I definitely experienced. I'm sure a lot of marginalized people experience also, where it's like, if we can just minimize ourselves, if we can be the perfectionist, if we can like just please everyone around us, and we show that we do not make mistakes, then we will be safe from the racism, the transphobia, the anti-queerness. But then that is ultimately detrimental to ourselves, right?
Right, yeah, it causes people to spread themselves too thin, not worry about their own mental, physical health as they try to feel that safe feeling, and please everyone around them, which is something that I think, yeah, it's just a natural default, unfortunately. And I did like that one of the points that Lark makes is sort of, I'm going to paraphrase, sort of like, when do we get a break? Like, when do we get to kind of rest? And so, yeah, I love that. I think that it was really important to bring up and to have included in there, and to have Lark work throughout the whole book. Just when do they get to feel at ease? Yeah. Lev, what about you?
Well, I mean, I agree with Kason. I think that a lot of it has to do with safety. And, you know, it's obviously very different for a white queer man in the 50s, where there's this ability to hide, essentially. And I think because of that, and this is still happens today, and I got into this in camp too, you know, there is a very strong temptation to hide yourself, to hide your sexuality and become part of the system that oppresses yourself, essentially. And I think that is, you know, you see it today in mask for mask culture, which is what I got into in camp. But in the 50s, it would have been, you know, almost a life and death situation. You would hide and you would become part of the system, because otherwise you would be arrested, you would be kicked out of your apartment, you would be, you know, you'd be disowned. There are so many ways that being yourself would be a dangerous thing to do in the 50s, as a queer person. And so you have this ability to hide yourself, so you do. But what's really great about the 50s, and especially in San Francisco, is it also did have this thriving queer community. There were queer bars all over the place. So while the world at large was telling you to hide yourself away, which Andy does, what he realizes over the course of the book, and what I get to explore in the series, is this queer community and the fact that, you know, he gets to actually have a life. And maybe it's not quite the life he imagined. Maybe it's not the life that is the safest, but it is a life where he gets to be happy and live. And that to me is what was so exciting. And I think it combines well with both noir and detective fiction in general, because in detective fiction, you know, people are always trying to hide something for their safety. You know, there are murders maybe for money, for love, revenge, but in the end, it comes down to a fear, you know, a form of fear. I'm afraid this person doesn't love me. I'm afraid I won't have enough money to live the way I want, etc. So historical mystery in general, I think, has fear at its root. And when we're talking about, you know, historical criminality, queerness also is one of those crimes, and it also has fear at its root too. So I think that being able to explore those two things in tandem is what made mystery the right genre for this queer history.
And so sticking with you and with Lavender House and kind of continuing on that, you do create this beautiful haven of a house where everyone within can be open and can feel free. But when we enter the house, we do find out that there is a little bit of like discord and a sense that there might be some like scuffling. I'm not sure if that's the right word for positions within the house, and like the power of the family dynamic within the house. And so aside from like the obvious of like needing plot for your book, like there has to be some kind of discord for plot to happen. Did you feel any pressure to make this family and the relationships within it perfect, to make them maybe not have as much sort of like fluctuation and little bits of sniping that they did have, to try to like continue with this beautiful like utopia feeling of the house?
No.
Okay.
It never occurred to me to like make the family perfect, because they might be able to be free within the house, but they have to live in the world. And so that creates such an unpleasant conflict where you're sort of trapped in this house with these people where you get to be free, but you also, the moment you leave, you have to give that all up. And it becomes this sort of like, you're always on guard. Who's going to come into the house? How do you protect yourself? When you leave the house, how do you remember not to act like you are in the house? And then on top of that, they're just people. So I wanted to make sure that they all are flawed in their own ways and their relationships. And, it's a relationship, the marriage at the center of it isn't, a loved one. Henry, who is Pearl's son, his wife was essentially found for him by his mothers. They were like, all right, you're going to be head of the company. It's a soap company. You need a wife. And they hit the bars covertly. It would have just been Pearl who masqueraded as her wife's assistant, which is a whole other power thing, especially as like the one woman of color in the house. And she goes out and she finds someone who looks right and is willing to pretend to be straight and pose for magazines and be the perfect housewife in exchange for all this safety. And it's about what you give up for safety and how that bargain maybe isn't always doesn't turn out being what you wanted it to be. And for Cliff, Henry's boyfriend, who masquerades as his personal assistant, it becomes like really sort of untenable because he has a past that starts to catch up with him. And that means, he has to stay in the house. And it becomes fully a prison at that point. Even if he is allowed to be himself in it, the fact that he cannot leave and live a life is what essentially makes it so dangerous and horrifying in some ways. And it's not about them, it's about what living in a straight world forces queer people to be.
I did really like the juxtaposition with the house, where yes, it's essentially like a gilded cage. And I like what you said about while you might have all the freedom in the house to be exactly who you are, they do live in the world and have to worry constantly about being themselves out in the world, like transitioning that freedom and I guess masking when they leave. And I really liked the way you carried that through the whole story, and there were just different notations of it, and the way it affects different people in the story was interesting. And I liked the way it brought everybody together and connected everybody. It's really interesting. Kaysen, you include mentions of the pandemic and protests in Larkin Kasim, when many authors have chosen to skip time or pretend that within the world that they're creating for their books that those things have never happened. So can you share with us why it was important to make sure that both the pandemic, mentions of the pandemic and protests were included within Larkin Kasim?
Yeah, no shade. I just think that if you skip over the pandemic or pretend it didn't happen, then that becomes like almost a speculative novel at this point because we are so affected by the pandemic and by the protests that were happening at that point. The longer answer is that I actually wrote this still in like, I think towards the end of 2020 when I didn't even really know how the pandemic was going to turn out and I had just experienced the protests and the murders and everything that was happening in that year. And the book was actually, the first draft was like the opening scene with Lark and their mom had like a radio announcement saying there's a mysterious illness that we don't really know about yet. So it was actually like the timeline was originally going to follow all of 2020. And I realized as I was writing that draft that it was a little bit too constricting, like it was a little bit too difficult to move out of the, like characters literally couldn't interact if they were in quarantine, for example, but then also just very like emotionally, I didn't want to trigger any readers as we were going through kind of like the more emotional moments of the murders and the deaths. So I kind of like pulled back and decided to have it in a more vaguer timeline where it's like 2021, maybe 2022, to give space to allow those characters to interact and to have more conflict and to not potentially trigger anyone with those specific incidences. But yeah, I thought it was important because it has affected our current society. So I don't want to ignore it.
Yeah, and it definitely fit within the overall like themes and context of the book. And it would have been strange. It would have felt, I like what you said about some of those stories coming across as speculative now because we have as a society been so deeply affected and it feels strange to not sometimes see it included.
Mm-hmm.
So we are sort of at like the 15-minute mark. I still have lots of questions that I selfishly want to ask, but I feel like it's only fair to pop into the Q&A. And we do have a question there. So I'm going to answer that one first and remind our audience that Q&A is open. Please feel free to drop your questions in there. Don't be shy. I do have some more questions to ask, so we'll just continue on until I sort of see any additional pop up. But the first question is a craft question from Tony, which is great because I have craft questions as well. Both of you write your pieces in the present tense, which is less typical than past tense. Why did you choose that tense?
For me, it's because that's always the tense I use with contemporary. It just feels like it's happening right now. But I am curious to know, because I feel like if I write historical, I would probably just kind of like gravitate towards past. So I'm curious to know what Lev's answer is.
I think that in mystery, if you're writing a first-person book, you have to keep it present. Otherwise, it becomes one of those like, yes, I'm recounting this mystery. And also I think the issue with past tense is, the narrator is safe generally. I mean, you can do one of those twists and I'm a ghost sort of thing. But I don't go for that. And again, no shade to those who do, but it's just not what I want to write. I think it feels a little out of place in a historical unless it's a ghost story. So I knew I wanted to do first person, and past tense just felt a little off to me in that regard. I also just like present tense. It just feels active in ways that past tense doesn't. And it's funny, I think, I came up sort of when I started writing, I would write in present tense and people would be like, oh golly, that is so weird, I can't even read it, how strange. And now I feel like many books are in present tense. I think it has become a little more common.
I think the thing I'm curious about trying eventually, I've seen it only done like twice, is third person present tense. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Wait, is that it? Yeah, I think it is. Like, I feel like
he does
only
this,
third
she
person
does that, they do this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm into it.
I mean, yeah, I feel like, yeah, I mean, that feels pretty normal to me. When I teach creative writing, the one I always love to do is like, I want you all to write in second person.
Yes. I am a second person lover. I love that.
I think it's so much fun. And I think second person present tense is like, whoa, it's like electric. It's a little like I imagine snorting cocaine is like, it just feels like, so it's hard to sustain, but it's really fun to do. If we're talking craft, my teacher brain kicks in. So that's your assignment, audience. Go write a second person present story.
Fully support that. So since we are talking a little bit about craft and publishing, I'm going to steer my questions that way for our last couple of minutes together. So Lev, in your acknowledgements, you thank your sensitivity readers. And so this is something that comes up fairly often on like writing Twitter, I feel like. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us sort of like why you worked with a sensitivity reader and a little bit about the benefits of that relationship strengthening your book and your story.
Oh yeah, I mean, I swear by sensitivity readers, and I have my friend Terry whose own book, novella, came out from Tor recently, and it is just brilliant. They write under Zin E. Rockland, I believe is what they write under. Oh no, I don't know their pen name by heart. I'm a bad friend. And it's called Flowers for the Sea. That's probably an easier way to find it. And they are just so good at being like, here's how you need to think of things. Like, here is my perspective. Here is an outside perspective on something that, cuts through your own, it's like I said in the beginning, you write primarily for yourself first. But when you start thinking about an audience, when you start thinking about readers, in YA, I always say, you don't want to betray a teenager. You don't want to like attempt to lead a teenager into sort of a moment where it's like, haha, this great person who it turns out hates, is a Nazi or something. Like that feels both false and like just sort of awful. It feels like an actual friend sort of like betraying you, and I hate that. I think in adults it's a little more complicated because like you can get away, you have that layer where adults sort of understand that bad people in a book are still characters and don't necessarily impact the reader in the same way that a young person reading a book feels impacted by a character, I think. But what a sensitivity reader does is they give you perspective, and it's a specific perspective as opposed to just sort of any other critique partner. But it's a perspective that is needed to sort of cut through your own views and make sure that you understand the place that your writing has in the world and that you are respecting that place. And that's really all it is to me. And I think it's always been so helpful because it just, I don't know, I've never encountered a moment where I was like, oh gosh, no, I want to fight back on that. I've just always felt, oh yeah, that makes it better. That makes it better. And sometimes we've talked through stuff. Sometimes I'm like, oh, but I want that to be offensive in this way. And Terry will help me out and, make sure that it sings in the right way. But generally, I think that it's just a particular kind of critique that shows you what place your writing has in the world at the moment and how best to reach readers. I don't know. I people like complain about it and say it's censoring, and I've never understood that. I've never had that experience.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like that does seem to be a little bit of the back and forth that I'll see as well. And so that was why I wanted to ask, because I think it can be so valuable to hear that it's not that, and that it is meant to be helpful and make books better and increase perspective. And it's also valuable to hear that sometimes authors will want something to be a little bit more edgy or offensive, but for a specific reason, for a craft reason, and then to be able to work through that with a sensitivity reader so it isn't horrible, you know what I mean, is good to know as well. It's good to hear.
I have a YA book coming out in the spring that a large part of it takes place in contemporary Greece. So like I sought out a queer Greek reader to help me make sure I was getting all those details right, especially couldn't travel to Greece during the pandemic. So like it's just about getting it's a form of research, and research is, there's that old adage, write what you know, and I think that people often interpret that wrong, and what it means is know before you write. It means do research, and research often is talking to people, and if you're going to take people's time, you should pay them for it. Like it's so simple to me, and then doing that research is what makes you a better writer, because then then you could write what you know. There, that's, I connected it. I got back to round to what
So I have been given a time warning, but Kason, I want to hear from you on this before we go and before I do our whole wrap up. So Lark desperately wants to be a published author. This is a huge part of the book. They send a lot of queries for early pages that the book isn't fully written. And they receive a lot of questionable feedback, like paraphrase examples of this would be, this voice is too teen, the story doesn't feel Black, the MC is too self-aware for a teen. And then there was also some great, and by great, I mean feedback from a critique group, which my favorite of that was didn't have time to read. Awesome. So if you could share just one or two pieces of writing advice that you have found to be super valuable for your writing practice and even publishing practice, I think that would be really great before I close this out.
Yeah. Fun story. Those are actually all real professional reviews that I've received. So that was my way of being that was me being I know what y'all are going to say, but I literally don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. So the advice I would give is actually it would go along in those lines, is to really write what your heart is saying, and to really follow the joy of what it is that you really want to write, regardless of what you think people are going to say, regardless of what you think the marketing is, whether your book is going to work or not, because I feel like you can't be led wrong if your joy is your compass into taking to you what you really want to write. I feel like that's the only way to find success sometimes. Follow your joy. Forget what people are saying.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. That's perfection. Thank you both so much. I'm going to close this out by just saying a huge thank you to everyone who joined us today. This was an amazing conversation. I had a lot of fun. Up next at 11, we have hashtag screaming, crying, throwing up, romance in YA, and conversation, world building in science fiction. So thank you to the Salem Athenaeum and all of our sponsors. And of course, thanks to our audience members again. And you can purchase our authors' books at our sponsor, Wicked Good Books in Salem, or Copper Dog Books in Beverly, or from your favorite retailer. A reminder that Lark and Kasim is out on September 27th, and Lavender House is out on October 18th. So please pre-order. It's so important. And our festival is free for everyone. Each year we've done it, but if you are able to support us at all, we would love that and value it very highly. There is a donate button that has been added to the chat. And please enjoy the rest of Lit Fest. Thank you.